think that when we think about leadership, oftentimes we reflect on leaders that we've actually had encounters with, and then that somewhat shapes our idea of what a good leader should be, or if we've had a bad experience, what a bad leader might look like. So I think that a lot of our views about leadership are shaped by our own personal experiences. And, we have experiences with leaders from childhood. There's always someone who's telling you what to do, kind of from the beginning. So we're all very aware of what types of leaders we might like or what types of leaders we might not like.
But does your research inform people, politicians or companies? Are you using the research to change people's ideas about leadership?
Well, I think that people can certainly change their leadership approach, absolutely. We know that people can develop certain skills if they want to. If somebody isn't looking to change their leadership approach or develop in some way, then obviously that wouldn't happen. But leadership can absolutely be developed.
What about this fascinating area of your research that seems to suggest that facial features can determine what kind of leader you are?
Yeah, this was actually a really surprising project that we did. There are some things that we already do know about facial features and leadership. For example, we know that leaders that have a particularly competent look or a dominant look would be really good at politics, and similarly having a very competent look is of benefit to somebody who's a CEO.
So what are the characteristics of a dominant look?
Well, one of the things, if you have there's kind of a width to height ratio of the face. So if your face is wider than it is kind of tall, then that can actually be particularly of benefit to people in the financial sector. It gives you a kind of a very imposing look. So that's one of the specific facial features.
And how people use their bodies and their faces, does that change people's perception of their leadership? We've learned a lot about body language over the years.
Yeah. I haven't looked at body language in particular, but with the facial features, there's not a lot that you can do short of plastic surgery. If you've got a certain type of look, then that's what you've got. But what was really interesting about this project that we did, we were kind of building on some of this other research about this dominant look or a competent look to try to see whether people could actually identify what type of leader somebody was just by their face. And so what we did was we removed all sorts of cues that might kind of give it away what type of leader they were. So we just presented people with a cutout of a person's face, and we made it in black and white, and they were able to identify above chance whether somebody was a sports leader, a CEO, or a military leader. People weren't as good at identifying whether they were a political leader or not, but I thought that was just fascinating that with nothing to go on, we somehow know what type of leader they might be.
And what is behind that?
Right, so we actually did a follow-up study because after we got that result, we were really interested in, so what are people relying on? And so we asked people how warm they thought a person looked. We asked them about level of competence, attractiveness, and so then what we found from that was that the business leaders and the political leaders have more of a competent look. And that we found that the military leaders, they had a low level of warmth, which makes sense. You don't want somebody maybe who's very warm and kind looking leading you into battle. And then we found that the sports leaders were more attractive and they were warmer looking. So we don't know exactly what facial features correspond to those judgments, but those were the types of cues that people were relying on to be able to identify them, what domain these leaders belong to.
We've certainly heard about symmetry and how people trust faces that are well balanced.
Yes.
Is that part of it?
I'm sure it is, yeah. I'm sure that it is, yeah. I mean, it would be really interesting to look a little bit more about kind of the more specific facial features that might be indicating that somebody was particularly warm or competent.
What about leadership violence? Tell me about that area of research that you've done.
Right. So with the topic on leadership violence, what we found was that there's multi-level influences that would lead to a leader being violent. So just in terms of the personality of the individual leader, if they have a strong sense of entitlement, they're not very open to hearing other things, they're very distrustful of information, then that could lead them to be more violent. And also if they are ideological in nature, so if a lot of their decisions are based on values that they hold strongly, and they'll kind of do anything for those values. And then at the group level, if the group is quite insular and they don't let others in, then that can also be something that can lead to this violent leader emerging. If there's a climate where there's corruption, and if violence is sanctioned in that particular area, then a leader who has these violent tendencies would be more likely to be embraced and emerge successfully.
Because violence is quite a strong word, isn't it? I was going to ask you what sort of situations and scenarios evolve that we can really understand how violent these leaders are, what we can do about it.
Right. Well, in that particular study, we actually used leadership biographies of world leaders, who were either violent or not violent, and then we tried to draw distinctions between those. So what was happening in those different situations that would allow that person to be successful in their violent act. So yeah, we were looking at things like terrorism, genocide, things like that. So really serious.
This is incredibly important research, isn't it? Can you take the research forward? Can anyone take this research forward and try and plan to counterbalance these very violent people in our society? Is that the direction this research will go in, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that was really the intent of that, is to really try to shed light on this. So how can we predict in a situation where there might be some of these environmental factors in place, if there's a lot of corruption, if there's instability, if people have had like losses of resources, things like that, some of the environmental variables that might lead to a violent leader emerging. And then hopefully we would be able to kind of look out for leaders that might be starting to pop up in those areas.
So are there particular characteristics of behaviour that you think, this is in the terrorist area, this is dangerous, and we need to track these people because it's very obvious that these people are going to be a big problem?
I think it's really, really difficult. We have some indicators, but it's not like we have a recipe book to say, we've found this leader in this type of situation that's showing, these 5 characteristics. Let's kind of keep an eye on them, because there might be several people, like many people like that, especially if it's in a troubled area, troubled region of the world. But the hope is that we can kind of narrow the scope to try to shed a light on some of these individuals.
And do you think the future of this research could also be related to business? So obviously the whole discussion of leadership is very topical in business at the moment, and the evolving role of HR directors. We're talking about extremes here in violence and terrorism, but do you think in future you'll be able to relate this in some way to help some of the conflicts that happen day to day in business?
I would hope so, yeah, because I think that if there is a climate of corruption in an organization, then you'd want to look out for the individuals that might be kind of leading that or having a big influence on that culture. But I think that there's some other research, not mine, but there's some other research that shows that in general you don't find these really, really bad people. It's more that there's a lot of people that are a little bit bad, and that's how these things end up happening, that a lot of people break the rules a little bit.
Well, Dawn, thank you very much. That's a wonderful interview and very interesting.
Great, thank you very much.